Welcome to your first lesson on safety information and scientific method. Now again, these symbols and all that kind of stuff, you will be tested on these, so you want to memorize what their meanings are. There'll be questions like matching the symbol to its definition, but it'll also be situations. So if I told you that you had oxygen in a tank, which symbol do you think should go on that tank? Well, then it would be the compressed gas symbol over here. Or if I told you that somebody was dealing with an infectious bacteria in the lab, what symbol should you probably put on that? Well, then you'd have the biohazard symbol and whatnot. So you need to know the corrosive and whatever. The two symbols that people tend to get mixed up a fair bit are this T for toxic over here, and then the skull and crossbones. The big difference between these, they're both poisonous. They'll both injure you physically, but the difference is that this is toxic, causing other effects. It's not necessarily an immediate poison that'll get you now. This might build up in your body and get you later for the toxic T. Over here with the skull and crossbones here, this one is going to be a much stronger effect and sooner effect than this one will. So this one is immediately dangerous, and this is dangerous over time, or will be maybe damage your liver and cause problems later. So you need to know the difference between those two. Usually those are the type of ones I throw in a test so that you can tell the difference there. Okay? As far as these household symbols go, hopefully it's easy enough for you to see. This is the most dangerous one, and this is the, have caution, but it's not the end of the world. These also go by color as well. There's usually red and yellow. But some of your products, like if you grabbed a spray can or let's say a cleaning product from underneath the sink right now, you want to grab that, you would see symbols like this. Usually they have a symbol on the inside for the household. So you'd have, this one's corrosive. It's some kind of acid or strong base. You learn about that in grade 10, and it'll actually burn your skin. So you want to make sure that you don't make contact with your skin. Obviously this one will be the poisonous one, flammable and explosive. So you do, and sometimes it's explosive not just on its own, but explosive like if you heated up the spray can, it would explode because it's already a gas under pressure. So as important as it is for you to know these symbols up here for a job site that you might be working at, even working at McDonald's, you have to go through the WHMIS training. You're also going to want to make sure that you know your household symbols so that you're safe at home. Okay? That's the symbols. Let's run through quickly the lab safety rules. So obviously we want you to act responsibly and we want you to follow instructions. That's a no-brainer, right? Students who don't, well, you're going to be asked to sit out that lab. If I have to ask you a few times to be safe, I'm not going to be able to turn my back and trust you. If I'm talking to another group, then that's the only time when you'd have to sit out of a lab. I'm not expecting that with anybody. I'm expecting you guys to be very well behaved. I'm expecting you to love doing the labs and to want to get involved. So that's usually just, we say it because we have to, not because we ever have to follow through. Make sure that when you do a lab assignment, I'm always going to give you some kind of a booklet. Just read it all through right in advance, okay? In advance means just before we start, or it could mean maybe the day before when I give it to you. You can read it before you walk in. The reason you want to do that is sometimes you've got a lab where you've got multiple steps and you have to actually start something right away so that in 5 steps from now you can keep going. So for example, let's say you had to boil something. You had to put a test tube into a beaker and boil it. If you didn't at the very beginning turn on the hot water and get it boiling, you wouldn't be ready by the time you had to put the test tube in. So things like that. You want to read through and then you can, with your lab partners, divide and conquer. Okay? Let me know if you've got any kind of special allergies. Sometimes you don't mention it because maybe it's hay fever or something, and we don't need to worry about that. But if you've got a food allergy to something weird like, or unusual, like, I don't know, you're allergic to watermelon, and that's kind of an unusual one that people don't usually get allergic to. Sometimes we do have, in some of the labs, we might have some foodstuffs around, and I want to make sure that we're not exposing you to something that could hurt you, okay? When you get here, and we're actually in the building together, we're going to go through the lab safety equipment. I'll show you where the eye wash station is and how to use it, fire blanket, first aid, all that kind of stuff. There's no point in us doing that right now because you're at home. Any glassware that gets broken, so even if it's just a little chip or something, the type of glass that we use isn't safe to heat up if it's even slightly chipped. So we always make sure you let me know if there's anything that's broken, whether it's broken when you take it out of the cupboard or whether it's broken because of something that you guys did. Let me know. We'll clean it up properly and we'll put it away. And again, I'll show you where that proper place is and how to do that when we get back here in the building. Make sure that anything you take, whether it's a solid or a liquid, make sure it's labeled properly. So a lot of things are going to end up looking like water. You're going to see that in your high school career. You're going to see that you have 4 different liquids in front of you, and none of them are water, but they all look identical to water. So you want to make sure that you're always labeling what you take, so the hydrochloric acid doesn't suddenly get mixed up with something else that looks exactly the same. You're going to see when you get into the building that we are attached to a storage room. You just can't go in there, and that's pretty simple instruction. Never take chemicals away from here. Let me know if there's any kind of an accident, injury, or emergency. This one is a test question, so make sure you remember that it's no matter how minor you think it is, okay? You are not qualified to know whether something is major or minor because you don't know what other substances have been in the room. You don't know what the other class before us might have been using a certain chemical that suddenly you get a paper cut and that chemical can get into you and cause you some damage. So just let me know. Even if it's minor, I'll let you know whether it's major or minor, and we can get that sorted. So anything that happens, accident, injury, or emergency, let me know. Please, please, please. We'll keep everybody safe in here. Got to wear our PPE. This is a word that's very common now that everyone's been through COVID. So personal protective equipment, everybody knows this word now. This just basically means for us that if it's a type of lab where we're wearing goggles, the goggles have to stay on. Now, our first 2 labs, we don't actually have to wear any personal protective equipment because there's not really any chemicals that we're too worried about. But our last lab, where we end up blowing some things up and creating some fire, we're going to want to make sure that those goggles are on the entire time. Okay? And you'll see that when we get there. When you're doing a lab, and I'll show you again when you get in the building, you're always standing up. Never sit down near a lab bench because if something falls and you're standing, you can jump away very quickly. But if it falls and you're sitting down, it's more likely to land on your lap and you're not going to be able to get away as fast. Plus, you give it a bigger surface area to land on. So maybe if you're standing up, you might have gotten splashed a little, but if you're sitting down, maybe the whole container lands in your lap. So we're never sitting down if we're using chemicals at the lab bench. In addition, you don't want your hair or your clothes touching or getting into either fire or the chemicals themselves. So always make sure that long hair gets tied back and all the loose and baggy clothing, we just don't wear that during a lab day. Okay? Always wearing shoes. That means that you can't wear sandals. No sandals allowed. Now it's wintertime. But we are Canadian, and some of you guys like to wear your Birkenstocks and socks. So don't be doing that during a lab day. Any other day, no problem. But lab days, you have to have your entire top of your foot covered. So running shoes are going to be your best bet for that. Don't eat anything in here unless I tell you to. If I'm telling you to, I'm not trying to trick you. It'll be safe to do so, but don't just taste stuff in here unless I'm actually asking you to. And you want to make sure we're not eating in here, with the exception that we've got these weird COVID rules where you do have to eat in here during lunch. So we're just going to make sure that all the chemicals are squared away when it is lunchtime. And a lot of times we'll try to do chemicals in a different room if there's a different lab available, so you're not eating in the same room. You really don't want to be having open beverages. So you can have like a water bottle, not a problem as long as it's sealed up. But we're not eating or chewing during labs or during lessons as well, just to keep everything kind of clean and safe in here so the chemicals don't get into your body. Okay? Don't start without me around. That just makes sense. Have your teacher around when you're doing your lessons and doing your labs. When you're keeping your area clean, you are going to be able to do your lab a lot better. You're not going to be worried about spills or knocking things over. So you're just going to try to keep everything uncluttered. And you don't want any textbooks or anything sitting on a lab bench just in case something spills. Or maybe you just turn on the tap and the tap sprays some water somewhere. You don't want to be wrecking your books. So your binders or my textbooks, you don't want to be wrecking those suckers. So only keeping exactly what you need at the workbench, which will usually just be the handout that I give you. I usually give you a separate lab handout, so in case anything goes wrong with it, you don't ruin your whole notebooklet. Anything that spills, we clean up right away. And again, I'll show you this when you get into the building, but this is an important number here. 10 to 15 minutes is how long you would have to wash off either your skin or even your eyeballs. If you have some kind of a chemical like an acid on your skin or in your eyes, you want to make sure that you wash that off right away so that you're not going to have that chemical against your skin. Or even worse, you don't want to have that chemical up against your eyeballs. So 10 to 15 minutes is the minimum if you know you've got some kind of a chemical like that on you. The problem with the eyes is that you're going to have to hold your eyes open and put them into the eye wash station for that amount of time and have the water flushing your eyes. Very uncomfortable. I'll show you when you guys get in here how to do that. But this number here is important to remember for your first quiz, 10 to 15 minutes or until you can get proper help. Okay, so you just keep going until the emergency people arrive. The same thing goes for treating any kind of a burn that you might have. You want to put that area underwater as well. And you want to do that because it's going to prevent the burn from being as bad as it could possibly be. You're going to cool down the skin right away, and it's going to prevent you from having skin peeling and all sorts of stuff, depending how bad the burn is. Even if you're just at home and you burnt yourself on a hot pot or something like that, you want to make sure that you're cooling it down for about 15 minutes to help treat that burn. Hand wafting or hand waving is the way that you're going to smell some stuff. Our very first lab on your first day back, you're going to be doing wafting, and I'll go over this again with you. It's basically, imagine that you have a coffee cup in front of you and you want to smell it. Instead of shoving your nose over the top of your cup, I want you to hold the cup, take your hand and just kind of bring the steam towards your face instead of actually shoving your face in the cup. That's what wafting is. It's just bringing the smell to you rather than bringing your nose to the smell. Some of these things that you're going to be smelling are very strong, and you're going to regret not wafting. Let me tell you, it'll burn the lining of your nose. You're going to be very uncomfortable. So make sure that you follow that instruction on our first lab. And again, I'll show you that right before we start the lab. When you're pulling out any plugs, we're not doing that in the first little while. Just make sure that you are pulling out by the actual plug itself and not by the cord, because otherwise the cord starts to separate. It's like when you're pulling out your phone charger. If you keep tugging on the cord itself instead of the actual plug that's in the wall, you end up like pulling the cord out of the plug, and it just ends up damaging it. So just want to make sure we're prolonging the life of our equipment here at school, so you're only pulling on the plug, not the cord. Plus, don't touch anything with wet or damp hands. This is a test question. It's an easy one. Water conducts electricity very nicely if it's got stuff in it, and you can get electrocuted if you have wet hands when you're touching electrical devices, so don't do it. Glassware, again, we'll go over this when you guys get in here. Just don't use anything that's broken or chipped. Let me know if you find that it is or that you break it yourself. We'll clean it up and we'll put it in the broken glass container. It's total garbage because it'll shatter if we put anything hot in it, so it's useless to us. We're not going to use that beaker or that test tube if it's slightly damaged, okay? Make sure you read things carefully. Don't take anything that you haven't been told to do in your lab. I'll show you what a scupula is. I'll show you a picture of it. This is a scupula. This little kind of a metal thing. It's about maybe 4 or 5 inches long, and it's what we use to pick up dry chemicals in the lab. So if you want to put it into a beaker and take it back to your station or whatever, we use the scupula. The idea is with the scupulas, because they're touching chemicals, you need one scupula for every chemical that you're using. So if we had like 3 or 4 powders in front of us, we would want 3 or 4 scupulas, one for each powder, and never use scupula number 1 for powder number 2. That way you're not going to be contaminating anything. Don't mix chemicals other than what you've been asked to do, because they can have unintended consequences and maybe some chemical reactions that we don't want to have happen. And then make sure that if you are taking something from the front and it has a lid on it, you always put the lid back on before you walk away. Even if someone's right behind you, you make sure that you're good to have tightened the lids before you walk away. I'll show you this again when we get into the lab, but when you heat a test tube, you want to make sure that it's the open end of it. Let me show you a test tube. When you are heating up a test tube and you see something like this here, you don't want to heat it directly from the bottom right here, because if you heat it up from the bottom, there's too much heat for this glass to handle, and you can actually shatter the glass or crack it, and then you have things leaking and unintended consequences, right? So you would actually make sure that you turn this to the side. So imagine now it's on its side, and you would have the flames coming here, and so that the flames would spread out along the entire side of it, but you would have this at its side so that it heats up just along the edge of it. But the important thing is when you're heating it up along that side there, you're going to have it at a slight angle, and you don't want the open mouth of this test tube pointed at anybody. So you would make sure that that is pointed towards the wall, not towards any classmates or yourself. When you're diluting an acid, you always pour the acid into the water. Remember this alliteration, A, A. Always add acid. And the basic idea here is when you want to get a very strong acid, but maybe you don't need it to be that concentrated, you just dilute it with water. But it's important that you add the acid to the water, not the water to the acid. So let's say here you've got 2 beakers. Let's pretend that the blue one is the acid and the clear one here is the water. Okay? You always want to take this and add it to this, not add the water to the acid. And the reason for that is you want to be able to control how fast the liquid's flowing. And the second thing is you want to control what splashes. So I want you to imagine for a second that you are skipping a rock out on a lake. Okay, skipping a rock out on a lake. And you're not like me. It's not like you just, maybe you are like me, and when you throw the rock, rather than it skipping across the lake, it actually just plops the first time straight into the water, doesn't skip even once. If you can imagine, if you can see that in your mind, that rock dropping into the water like that, can you see also in your mind's eye that the rock is the thing that sinks and the water that it's smacked into is the thing that splashes, right? So the rock will keep going down, but when it goes down, what it's really doing is it's squishing the water, and then the water bounces back because it doesn't want to be squished, and that's where the splash comes from. So if I take this acid and I pour the beaker into the water here, the water will be pushed down by the acid, and then it will bounce back up. If I did it the reverse and I took the water and I poured it into the acid, then it would be the acid that splashes back up. I don't want acid splashing on me. I would rather have water splashing on me. So I will take the acid and I'll add it to the water rather than the water added to the acid, because it's safer to have water splash back. Okay, so that's reason number one. Reason number two is I can control how fast I pour this. So I can go really slow if I want. What I can't do is control what the water's doing once I start pouring. So I want to be able to control how fast I'm adding the acid. So I want that in my hand, and I want to prevent any acid splashing back at me. Okay? So for those two reasons, always add acid. If you take something, so you've used your little scoopula, you've thrown some powder into a beaker and you've taken it to your container, it's garbage now. You either use it or we throw it away, okay? We never, ever bring it back to that original container, because what ends up happening is you end up contaminating the original. It's sort of like, let's say you were having a drink and then somebody was thirsty and they took your cup and they drank some of it. You don't necessarily want to go back to drinking that same drink again, because the other person maybe they backwashed or they contaminated your juice. You don't want to go back to that. So that's the same thing here. Once you take the chemicals out, you never want to put it back in and contaminate that original container. This is really important, and it's a rule that you need to follow for your entire high school career. Please, please, please don't wreck our stock solutions and whatever, okay? This says never dispose of chemicals down the drain. That's not 100% true. Some of our stuff can go down the drain, but check with your teacher and make sure. Some of the stuff has to go into special containers to be thrown out in a special way. It's hazardous materials. And other things, it's pretty safe. I mean, if we're dealing with sugar, it's pretty safe to put that down the drain. So it just depends which chemicals we're messing with, and I'll let you know how you're going to clean up for every lab, okay? If you're going to move stuff, if you have chemicals that you want to transport, just make sure that you have the right size. So let's go back to that beaker picture. All right. This is a good size beaker for this amount. You can see it's actually 200 milliliters is what's here. It's a 250 milliliter beaker, but you can safely transport 200 mils, because if it was 250 and you had it right filled up to the top, you're more likely to spill stuff on your way back to your lab. So let's say I did ask you to get 250 mils. Well, then don't use this beaker. Use a 400 mil beaker, and then you've got lots of space to carry stuff. So that's all that's saying. Just make sure you're not being stingy. Grab the right size beaker, grab the right size test tube, whatever it is that you're doing for your lab. Make sure that you can hold all the liquid or powder that you're supposed to be carrying. Okay, so hopefully that makes good sense. And then, of course, stick around until your experiment's done. Don't ditch your lab mates. Make sure that you're sticking around right to the end. And that includes making sure that at the end of your experiment, everything is clean and put away. And then you make sure that you have washed your hands, especially during COVID time when you guys might be touching the same beakers and whatnot. You want to make sure that you're keeping your hygiene really good. So you want to dry your hands at the end of every single experiment. And we have soap here in the lab to do that. So let's go through then one good reason why we have each of these safety rules here. Keeping your goggles on as long as there are any chemicals being used, even if you're finished your own lab. Why might that be a smart thing to do? Okay, so you want to make sure that you're not going to get splashed by somebody else's lab. Never eating, drinking, or chewing gum during the lab. The idea of chewing gum, what you're actually doing if you chew gum in a science lab is you are inviting those chemicals to stick to the gum because they'll be picked up in the air, and then you're just literally pushing it against the skin of your mouth the entire time. It's pushing it against your tongue the entire time. So you're concentrating the chemicals that are there. Not a good plan. So yeah, it's very easy to have the chemicals touch the food or touch your drink and then go into you. So that's why we don't want to do that. And we will make sure that we are perfectly cleaned up after lunch before we start any kind of a lab in the afternoon. Common sense. Why would you want to make sure your hands are dry? Have you ever been shocked before? It's not fun. Clothes catch on fire. Never run around. Why? What should you do? You guys learned this in elementary school. Stop, drop, and roll. Okay. Now, when you guys get in here and I show you the fire blanket, I'll go over this in more detail. But there are 3 things that every fire needs. You need to have some kind of a fuel, right? Oxygen, and the last one's the hardest one. The last one that you always will need is heat. Okay, so you'll definitely need to have something to burn. So you have the fuel. Then you need to have oxygen and you need to have heat. And what happens here is if you're already on fire, your clothes are on fire, that means that you have already provided the fuel. There's enough heat that it's already starting to burn. And when you run around, what you actually do is give it fresh oxygen, which is probably not the best thing, not the best idea. What you want to do is choke out the fire, right? So that's why we would use something like a fire blanket, which is basically just a very thick blanket. It's very tightly woven together so that air doesn't really pass through it very well. And you would stop, drop, and roll because you're trying to smother the fire. You're trying to put out its access to fresh oxygen when you roll. Fire blanket will do the same thing. You can throw it over top. And then fire extinguisher has a chemical on the inside that will do the same thing again. It'll smother the fire. And what it does is it separates the fuel from the oxygen itself so that you can choke out the fire. You may not be able to do anything about the heat. Sometimes you can cool it down. Water cools down fires. That's why they shut off. Plus, water also will block, because they now have a layer of water, you might separate the fuel from the oxygen and turn off the fire that way. So yeah, stop, drop, and roll, never run around. And again, this is one of those easy test questions that I'm sure you guys will get perfect on. When you get any chemical on your hand, you're going to flush it with or in your eyes, flush it with lots of running water until your teacher tells you to stop, minimum 15 minutes. What are you trying to prevent here? So this one here, some chemicals anyway, are actually able to burn you just like a fire could burn you. In fact, they can even do worse damage than a fire could do, or very similar damage. So you want to make sure that you're getting that chemical off of you. The reason it's for a minimum of 10 to 15 minutes is because it really binds really well to skin, and you want to make sure that any extra chemical is gone for sure. Never washing anything down the drain unless I tell you to do so. Why do you think that's an important rule to follow? That water gets recycled in our community, right? It gets filtered and it gets put back in. So we want to make sure that we're not adding any chemicals to the city water that could then cause somebody else to be sick later on. So we've got to dispose of things properly. It's kind of like you don't throw batteries in the garbage. You throw them into the proper battery disposal, because if you throw a battery into a landfill, then it leaks and then you get all these horrible chemicals in the landfill, and that's just a problem. Failure to follow safety rules will result in a suspension from lab activities. Why is that smart for me to do? Why should I kick you out of a lab? I don't want anyone to get hurt. So if people aren't following the rules, then we keep everybody safe by just telling someone to sit down and have a break. Now, if that happens, keep in mind, this is not just somebody horsing around and tossing stuff or breaking stuff. This is also somebody who's not wearing their goggles. If you're not wearing your safety goggles when you're supposed to, I'm going to ask you to sit it out. Now, what I'll do is, because you're still learning and you guys are new to the lab, I'll give you fair warning and I'll remind you. And then if I have to keep reminding you and I don't think you're safe in the lab, then I'll ask you to sit it out. You can watch from a distance. You still have to wear your goggles, but you have to watch from a distance. And then the next lab, you start fresh. Everybody gets a fresh start every time. These 3 questions here, I guarantee you, are test questions. These are on your quiz. So you want to make sure you have really good answers for them. When we say precautions or steps for safe handling, we're saying, what are you trying to do to make sure that you never get injured? Not what do you do after you get injured, but what do you do to prevent yourself from ever getting injured in the first place? So how can you stop yourself from ever getting poisoned in the lab? So that's 2 different ones. So don't put stuff in your mouth, and then make sure that you don't have some kind of a cut or something where you can get the chemicals into it. So wash your hands even to prevent poisoning. That would be a good plan. Okay, scalding is a fancy way of saying you got burnt by a hot liquid. How do you think you can prevent that from happening? Well, first of all, don't pick up a beaker that's hot with your hands, because you'll drop it and you'll throw the liquid everywhere. You could use proper gloves. You could use something called a beaker tong. I'll show you that when you guys get in here, where you can lift up hot glass using a rubber tong rather than your hands, things like that. So anytime that you can prevent it from spilling or from you actually touching the hot liquid, you're good to go. And then eye damage. This one's an easy one, but you got to think of 2 different ways to do it. How can you prevent eye damage? Now, the eye wash will be after you've already got something in your eye, right? So that can prevent further damage, but what can you do to make sure nothing gets in your eye in the first place? When I was up here talking about this rule, talking about heating the test tube and making sure that the open test tube is always pointed away from you, that's a very good way to make sure that any steam or anything that comes out, any material that shoots out of the top of that test tube will never get into your eyes. Yeah, sometimes when things heat, they expand and they get thrown out of the thing. That's why I want to make sure it's not pointed at anybody. So again, these are test questions. You want to make sure, this exact question is a test question. You want to make sure that you're good to have 2 good answers for each one of these things. And that it's not like the eye wash station where that's preventing further damage. It's a precaution, not a caution after the fact. You want to make sure that you are never actually causing the injury in the first place, okay? So have good answers for that.